Expanded version. It did not arrive like anything humanity had ever built a category for. No engine flare. No jump signature. No comms request. Just a shape, perfect, black, and impossibly smooth, hovering at Lagrange point 2 like it had been waiting there since the birth of the moon. Every telescope that locked onto it failed to agree on what it was made of. Spectrometers reported nothing. Radar returned absence. LiDAR bent around it like it refused to be measured. One technician at the European Orbital Observatory muttered the first honest words anyone would later admit to. "It's like it doesn't want to be real." Then it spoke. Not in sound. Not in radio. In pressure. A gravitational modulation rippling through Earth's detection grid, slipping past encryption like it had rehearsed the language of physics itself. Human linguists, physicists, cryptographers, people who normally disagreed on everything, all arrived at the same conclusion within hours. It was a message. And it was aimed at everyone. When translation finally stabilized, every military screen on Earth displayed the same sequence of words. You are designated prey. Surrender your orbital assets. Your world will be reassigned. There was a pause in the message. Not technical. Intentional. Then the final line appeared. Resistance will be entertainment. That last word did something no alien species understood about humanity. It didn't trigger fear. It triggered insult recognition. Admiral James Kincaid of Unified Earth Space Command read it twice, then leaned back in his chair aboard the command vessel UNS Valkyrie, orbiting quietly above the Pacific. Around him, officers waited for protocol responses. Panic. Escalation orders. Emergency diplomatic formatting. Instead, Kincaid exhaled slowly and smiled. "Well," he said, voice calm enough to be dangerous. "They opened with a threat and a punchline." A pause. "That's either arrogance or stupidity." A junior officer swallowed. "Sir, they have a ship mass we cannot classify. Possibly a carrier-class vessel beyond Neptune. Energy readings suggest." "I don't care what it suggests," Kincaid cut in, still smiling. "What I care about is what they think we are." He stood, hands behind his back, staring at the rotating hologram of the black object. "They think we're prey." The bridge was silent. Then he added, almost conversationally, "Which means they didn't do their homework." Beyond Neptune's orbit, in the cold dark where sunlight barely mattered, the Zalcor Dominion flagship drifted like a judgment waiting to be spoken. Inside, the bridge was calm. Controlled. Efficient. The Zalcor did not believe in panic. Panic was for species that had not yet optimized fear. Their commander, High Warden Zarvek, watched Earth on a projected sphere. Blue, fragile, overpopulated. A world that had never been properly disciplined. "They have received the ultimatum," Vek said. "Yes, Warden," his science officer replied. "No surrender response detected." A ripple of amusement passed through the bridge. "No surrender?" Vek repeated. "Interesting." A tactical officer leaned forward. "Shall we demonstrate orbital compliance force?" A pause. "Minimal," Vek decided. "One strike. A coastal city. No extinction. Just clarity." He gestured. A weapon far more advanced than anything Earth had ever built began charging, coherent stellar compression, refined through centuries of conquest. "Fire!" Vek ordered. The beam left their ship like a silent god reaching out to correct an error in existence. On Earth, no alarm systems triggered in time. Not because they failed. Because they had already been bypassed decades ago. The strike hit its target. A point in the Pacific Ocean. Or rather, what should have been a point in the Pacific Ocean. Instead, it hit a dead satellite. Designation, Hermes 7. Launch 2029. Decommission 2041. Officially classified as space debris. It absorbed the strike completely. And then it woke up. On the UNS Valkyrie, every orbital monitor lit red at once. "Impact confirmed," a technician shouted. But the target wasn't a target, it was a decoy mass platform. Kincaid didn't move. That wasn't a decoy, he said quietly. That was bait. In orbit, something ancient and human began to unfold. Thousands of dead satellites, abandoned research platforms, retired communication grids, military relics from the early space age, began synchronizing. Not via command uplink. Not via AI coordination. But via embedded, long-buried human contingency protocols. One officer whispered, almost disbelieving. Sir, those are museum pieces. Kincaid nodded. Everything in orbit is a weapon if you leave it there long enough. The second Zalcor strike never arrived. Because something else arrived first. Kinetic rods. Mass drivers. Orbital slugs accelerated by gravitational assists humanity had quietly engineered into decay paths decades earlier. They didn't glow. They didn't announce themselves. They simply were there when physics said they should be. The first alien escort ship shattered like glass under a hammer made of silence. The second attempted evasive maneuver. It failed because Earth had not aimed at ships. It had aimed at space itself. On the Zalcor bridge, confusion spread for the first time in living memory. Report! Vex snapped. We are losing outer fleet assets, came the reply. Unknown origin kinetic impacts. No propulsion signature. No launch detection. They are already in transit before we detect them. That is impossible, Vex said flatly. Then another ship vanished from the tactical display. And another. And another. The Dominion fleet, designed to dominate civilizations that understood fear, was being dismantled by something that did not behave like warfare. It behaved like cleanup. On Earth, Admiral Kincaid finally turned away from the hologram. They thought they were delivering a verdict, he said. He picked up a small communication console. They didn't realize they were stepping on old landmines. A junior officer hesitated. Sir, authorization to escalate? Kincaid looked at him. Then at Earth. Then at the incoming alien fleet burning fragments in orbit like falling ash. No, he said quietly. A pause. We're not escalating. He tapped a final command key. We're responding. Every surviving alien channel across the system suddenly opened. Not hacked. Not breached. Simply revealed. As if Earth had finally stopped pretending it wasn't listening. A human voice filled the Zalcor bridge. Calm. Controlled. Almost disappointed. You came to measure us, it said. Vex stiffened. Locate transmission source. It's not a location, the voice continued. It's a system. A soft exhale, like someone looking at a broken machine. And you just triggered it. The transmission ended. And deep beneath Earth's oceans, something long dormant began to unlock. Not defenses. Not shields. Something older. Something built on the assumption that someday, someone would confuse humanity for prey. On the UNS Valkyrie, Admiral Kincaid watched every orbital asset light up across Earth's shadow. Then he said the words no one on his bridge would forget. All right. They knocked. A pause. So now we stop being polite about the door. And for the first time since the Zalcor Dominion began its conquest cycle, their scanners detected something new coming online from Earth. Not energy. Not fleet movement. Not even weapon deployment. A doctrine. The Zalcor Dominion had conquered systems that bent physics around their will. They had shattered hive empires that communicated through neural oceans. They had erased machine civilizations that reproduced through self-rewriting stars. So when High Warden Tsar Vex saw his fleet begin to disappear in orbit above a backwater blue world, his first reaction was not fear. It was offense. This is miscalculation, he said sharply. A primitive species cannot project orbital denial without infrastructure. A pause. Then another ship vanished. No explosion. No warning. Just absence. As if the universe had forgotten it ever existed. A junior officer's voice cracked. Warden, we are losing formation cohesion. Something is intercepting vessels before our targeting systems even register them as threats. Vex's eyes narrowed. Show me. The tactical display updated. For the first time in his life, he saw something that didn't belong in any war doctrine. There were no enemy ships. No visible platforms. No orbital defenses. Just trajectories. Invisible lines in space where Zalcor vessels ceased to be. Like the battlefield was already written, and they were simply walking into sentences that ended in death. Predictive targeting? One officer suggested weakly. Vex snapped his gaze toward him. Predictive requires computation. This is not computation. Another impact. Another ship erased. Then, from Earth's direction, a signal. No encryption break. No transmission spike. Just presence. A human voice entered every surviving channel simultaneously. You're doing that thing where you assume we're improvising, it said. A pause. We're not. On Earth, the UNS Valkyrie floated above the Pacific like a patient knife. Inside, Admiral James Kincaid stood in front of a tactical wall that no longer showed enemy positions. It showed patterns. He didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. Okay, a systems officer said slowly. We've confirmed it. The orbital relic network is fully autonomous. It's not just kinetic platforms, it's layered redundancy systems across 70 years of space debris. Another officer swallowed. Sir, that means we didn't just deploy weapons. Kincaid nodded. We deployed history. A pause. And history remembers where things are allowed to exist. The officer frowned. That's not how orbital mechanics works. Kincaid finally looked at him. That's not how we use orbital mechanics. The Zalcor fleet attempted retreat. It was the correct tactical decision. It was also irrelevant. Because every direction they moved, something was already there. Mass shadows hidden in gravitational blind spots. Dead satellites that had drifted into perfect intercept arcs over decades. Mining platforms that had, accidentally, aligned themselves with future invasion corridors. Even discarded cargo shells from early Martian shipments had been quietly repurposed, filled, reinforced, forgotten. Earth had not built a defense grid. It had built a trap economy. And the aliens had just made themselves the prey. On the bridge of the Zalcor flagship, tension finally cracked. We are being herded, Vex said quietly. A science officer shook his head. By what? There is no coordinating intelligence signature. Vex stared at the hologram of Earth. No, he said slowly. It's worse than that. A pause. They are not coordinating. Another ship died in silence. Vex's voice dropped. They are consistent. On Earth, deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, something long buried finished waking up. It wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a philosophy encoded into hardware. A doctrine written in steel and patience and decades of political denial. The system name, buried in classified archives so deep even most governments had forgotten it, blinked online. Project, Afterburner Contingency. A junior analyst aboard Valkyrie whispered. Sir, we're receiving a global systems handshake. That's not military command structure. Kincaid exhaled once. That's civilian infrastructure, he said. Another officer frowned. Civilian systems can't coordinate orbital defense. Kincaid gave a small, tired smile. They're not coordinating. A pause. They're remembering how to be useful. The Zalcor flagship attempted its final doctrine, overwhelming fire. Every surviving ship synchronized weapons. A perfect volley. Enough firepower to sterilize continents. High Warden Vec gave the order. Burn the world. The fleet fired. And for the first time, Earth responded instantly. Not with ships. Not with lasers. Not even with counterfire. With denial. The alien weapons fired into a sky that no longer agreed to be a target. Their energy beams curved. Not by physics distortion, but by precalculated absence. Like Earth had quietly edited itself out of where destruction was allowed to land. A bridge officer screamed. Our targeting solutions are collapsing. Another shouted. The planet is rejecting impact vectors. Vex stared in silence as half his fleet's volley passed harmlessly through orbital coordinates that simply no longer mattered. Then, softly, "They didn't block us," he said. "They removed relevance." On the UNS Valkyrie, alarms never sounded. Because there was nothing left to alarm. Just silence across space. And a slowly tightening net of debris and dormant platforms converging on surviving alien positions. Kincaid watched it all. Then spoke without turning. "They thought we built weapons." A pause. "We built consequences that age well." A young officer finally asked the question no one had dared say aloud. "Sir, what happens when the last alien ship is gone?" Kincaid looked at Earth. At the ocean. At the dark machine systems waking beneath it like old instincts returning to muscle memory. Then he answered honestly. "Then we decide whether we're done being polite." In orbit, the Zalcor Dominion flagship began to realize something far more terrifying than defeat. Not that they were losing. Not that they were outmatched. But that Earth had never once deployed its central military doctrine. Everything they had faced so far was litter. And somewhere deep in Earth's command architecture, a final status line updated. Threat classification, still improvising. High Warden Zarvek had never negotiated from a position of uncertainty. That was for lesser species. Fragmented species. Species still learning the difference between power and permission. But now, his flagship hung in orbit over Earth like a wounded predator refusing to acknowledge it had been caught. Fleet strength reduced. Communications degraded. Morale fracturing in ways Zalcor doctrine did not even have words for. And Earth. Earth was quiet. Not dead quiet. Not empty quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something was listening back. Vex straightened in his command seat. "Open a channel to their leadership." A communications officer hesitated. "Warden, all previous contact attempts were." "Open it," Vex snapped. A pause. Then static. Then Earth answered. The voice came first. Calm. Familiar now. Almost bored. "You're still here," it said. Vex narrowed his eyes. "You are addressing High Warden Zarvek of the Zalcor Dominion. You will." Yeah, the human voice interrupted gently. "We read the introduction packet." A silence fell across the bridge. Even the Zalcor guards paused. Vex leaned forward slightly. "Then you understand your position." A soft chuckle came through the channel. That sound alone unsettled 3 officers. "Oh," the human voice said. "We understand it very well." A pause. "Do you?" On Earth, inside the UNS Valkyrie, Admiral Kincaid stood in front of a sealed data core labeled in 3 languages and one outdated military joke. If this is opened, they did not listen. A junior officer spoke quietly. "Sir, they're attempting formal contact. Protocol suggests." Kincaid cut him off. "Protocol assumes equal footing." He tapped the console. "We stopped being equals the moment they called us entertainment." Back in orbit, Vex forced control into his voice. "You have resisted engagement and inflicted unauthorized losses upon a Dominion expeditionary fleet. This constitutes an act of war." The human voice responded instantly. "No." A pause. "That's where you're confused." Vex stiffened. "Explain." The voice softened slightly. "You declared war when you sent the cylinder." Silence. Even Zalcor officers exchanged uncertain glances. The voice continued. "We just accepted delivery." On Earth, deep under multiple oceans and mountain ranges, systems long labeled defunct began synchronizing. Not activating. Not powering up. Synchronizing. As if waiting for a conversation to catch up to them. Admiral Kincaid watched the global map shift. A technician spoke. "Sir, civilian infrastructure is routing orbital telemetry. That shouldn't even be possible without permission?" Kincaid offered. The technician blinked. "Yes." Kincaid gave a faint smile. "We stopped asking for it about 60 years ago." On the Zalcor bridge, frustration turned into something more dangerous. Confusion. Vec leaned forward. We did not initiate planetary genocide. We issued a compliance directive. The human voice returned, slower now. You really wrote that down and thought it was normal, huh? A pause. Then, quieter. Yeah, that tracks. Suddenly, a second signal appeared on all Zalcor channels. Not from Earth's military. Not from Valkyrie Command. From everywhere at once. Civil frequencies. Emergency bands. Old satellite ghosts. Deep space radio noise that should have been silent. And then a document appeared. Translated automatically. Because Earth had already embedded translation protocols into the first alien contact layer decades ago. The title read, Interstellar Compliance Response Framework, Rev 9.3. Vec stared at it. This is a treaty structure. A subordinate officer frowned. Warden, it has our designation fields pre-filled. Another officer went pale. That's impossible. We have never been in contact before today. The human voice interrupted again. Oh, we didn't wait for contact. A pause. We prepared options. On Earth, Admiral Kincaid watched as the alien fleet slowly realized something worse than defeat. They were not the first. Not even close. Human contingency architecture was not built around if contact happened. It was built around when something arrogant enough would assume it was the first. A junior officer whispered, Sir, they're reading the treaty. Kincaid nodded. Good. And? Kincaid looked at the dark screen showing alien fleet positions. And now they're deciding whether they want to sign something we already enforced. Back in orbit, Vec read the document. Line after line. Clause after clause. Every possible outcome already mapped. Every escalation path already priced. Every violation already categorized. And at the bottom, a single human note. If you are reading this after hostile action, you skipped step 1. Vec's jaw tightened. This is unacceptable. The human voice responded instantly. We agree. A pause. That's why we built it. A Dominion officer finally broke protocol. This is not diplomacy, he said sharply. This is predetermination. The human voice returned, almost amused. Welcome to Earth politics. At that moment, every surviving Zalcor ship received a new message. Not a weapon. Not a threat. A map. Showing their exact remaining positions. And something worse. Predicted escape routes. All of them marked in red. All of them labeled. Failure probability certain. On the UNS Valkyrie, alarms remained silent. Because there was nothing left reacting unpredictably. Everything was already accounted for. Kincaid finally spoke. They're reading the treaty, he said. A pause. Then, quietly. Now we find out if they're smart enough to realize it was also a warning. In orbit, High Warden Zarvek closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not in Earth. In understanding. They did not prepare for war, he said slowly. His officers turned to him. They prepared for us. A silence. Then, softly. And we matched their assumptions. The human voice returned one final time. Not mocking now. Not amused. Just honest. You didn't discover a new world, it said. You walked into an old argument we already finished debating. A pause. And we wrote the conclusion down, just in case you arrived late. High Warden Zarvek did something no Zalcor commander had done in recorded Dominion history. He hesitated. Not for strategy. Not for recalculation. But for meaning. The treaty floated in front of him like a verdict written before the trial had ever begun. Clause after clause. Condition after condition. Every possible outcome already anticipated, categorized, and, most disturbing of all, judged acceptable by someone else long before the Zalcor arrived. Behind him, his bridge officers waited for the traditional response. Brutal retaliation. Escalation. Domination reasserted. Instead, Vec asked a question no one expected. When did they build this? A science officer swallowed. Warden, the earliest embedded timestamps suggest over 80 local planetary cycles. A pause. That's impossible, another officer said quickly. No civilization develops interstellar doctrine before they are invited? Vec interrupted softly. No one answered. Because the answer had stopped mattering. On Earth, Admiral James Kincaid stood on the observation deck of the UNS Valkyrie, watching orbital debris slowly settle into controlled decay arcs. The war, if it could still be called that, was no longer a sequence of battles. It was cleanup. A correction process unfolding with mechanical patience. A junior officer spoke quietly. Sir, they've stopped firing. Kincaid nodded. They've started thinking. And that's worse? Kincaid gave a thin, tired smile. For them? Yes. In orbit, the Zalcor fleet fractured. Not physically. Ideologically. Some ships attempted final aggression, automatic weapons firing at empty coordinates that no longer held Earth as a valid target. Those ships were quietly removed from the equation. Not destroyed in spectacle. Simply resolved. Others attempted retreat. Those discovered something worse. There was nowhere outside the system that hadn't already been accounted for. And a few, very few, stopped entirely. Awaiting instruction. High Warden Vec noticed that. And for the first time, he understood something uncomfortable. Earth was not fighting the fleet. It was classifying it. The human voice returned one last time. Not through intimidation. Not through frequency override. Through presence, as if it had always been there. You're out of options, it said. A pause. That's not a threat. That's math. Vec leaned forward. We are a Dominion fleet. We do not accept. You already did. The voice interrupted gently. Silence. Then, quieter. You just didn't read what you signed fast enough. On Earth, deep beneath multiple continents and oceans, final systems came online. Not weapons. Not shields. But adjudication frameworks. Old human war doctrines refined into something colder than vengeance. Something closer to inevitability. Admiral Kincaid stepped forward to the command console. A technician hesitated. Sir, final authorization requires your confirmation. Kincaid looked at the Earth projection. At the ocean. At the sky. At everything humans had ever built under the assumption that one day, something like this might happen. He spoke calmly. Begin enforcement. In orbit, the Zalcor fleet received the final message. It was not from Earth's military. Not from Valkyrie Command. Not even from any identifiable authority. It simply read, Jurisdiction confirmed. A pause. Then, compliance window closed. The Zalcor flagship's systems locked. Not hacked. Not overridden. Locked by permissions that predated their arrival. Vec stood slowly. This is not warfare, he said quietly. No one corrected him. Because now they understood. It never had been. It was administration. On Earth, Admiral Kincaid exhaled once. A junior officer asked, Sir, what happens to survivors? Kincaid stared at the screen for a long moment. Then answered honestly. They learn. A pause. And then they decide whether they want to come back properly, or not at all. In orbit, High Warden Zarvek looked at Earth one last time. Not as prey. Not as enemy. But as something far more unsettling. A civilization that had already written the rules of engagement, and simply waited for someone arrogant enough to ignore them. Vec activated his final transmission. Not a threat. Not a demand. A concession. We did not understand your world, he said. A pause. That was our failure. On Earth, Kincaid heard it. And for the first time since the cylinder arrived, he didn't smile. He simply replied, Yes. A pause. You're not the first. The fleet powered down. One by one. Not destroyed. Not erased. but submitted to systems that no longer classified them as threats worth reacting to violently. Only administratively. And as Silence returned to orbit, something strange happened. Earth turned its lights back on. Not because the danger was gone, but because it had been categorized. And humanity, as it always had, went back to work. Far beyond Neptune, drifting in the cold aftermath, a final Zalcor transmission echoed faintly through fading channels. They did not respond to our threat. A pause. They accepted it, as input. On Earth, Admiral Kincaid stepped away from the console. Next time, he said quietly, they should try sending a greeting instead. A pause. Then, almost amused, we respond better to manners. End of story.